we have to take advantage of having growth to actually produce a different type of economy. And that different type of economy is basically going to evolve around industrialization. And so the next question is, how are you going to fund that? How is going to finance, this transformation? And that's what this forum is about, is to demonstrate that you are going to finance it first and foremost with internal resources.
The 9th ADF Forum took place this year in Marrakech, Morocco. The Economic Commission for Africa's flagship event had a focus on innovative financing and the transformation of the continent through these very means. A plethora of attendees from across Africa were present in Marrakesh, from the high-level delegates from the Moroccan government, the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, Dr. Carlos Lopez, and the presidents of Senegal, Ivory Coast, and the Prime Minister of Cape Verde. The forum specifically sought to explore new and innovative ways of accruing financing on the continent and had a focus on the following key thematic areas: domestic resource mobilization, illicit financial flows, private equity, new forms of partnership, and climate financing. One of the principal themes of this year's forum, the targeting of illicit financial flows, is of primary concern, as the revelation that as much as 50 to 60 billion US dollars is leaving Africa annually means this is having a direct impact on the transformation of the continent and, more importantly, the resources available for further development. The sessions aim to find funding solutions and common ground for financing structures away from the traditional donor-led economy paradigms. Discussions were frank and robust and sought to encourage delegates to share analysis on what financing initiatives are now suffering fatigue and to engage on new modalities to protect income and raise revenues internally on the continent.
So private equity in Africa has grown tremendously over the past decade plus. Indeed, now we're seeing about 70 plus GPs that are looking for capital from the private equity market presently, and this has grown from maybe about 10 or less names 10 years ago. So it's a very exciting thing. What it really means is that we're developing an ecosystem around private equity where, different general partners can look at opportunities together, where there's a more buoyant exit environment as well, and just better opportunity for transparency and regulation, and makes it more attractive for investors around the world. So the culture of private equity, it's very important that government and policymakers get behind the private equity story. As you probably know, for young businesses, for family-owned businesses, it's very hard to get capital on the continent. The banks, if they're lending at all, is at astronomical rates. So very important that they have additional channels of capital, and that's where private equity can really step in. And not only from a capital perspective, but really from a value creation perspective as well, and actually assist entrepreneurs and management teams in developing their companies to global standards to help them grow. So with regards to what we can do to ensure that we get to that point, we need to attract local capital to the story. The more you can attract local capital to the local story, the more the international audience is going to take notice. And that's already started to happen a great deal. But I personally think that we can all do a lot more to attract that local capital. The pension industry, for example, has grown exponentially over the last several years. Nigeria, for example, went from close to zero in private equity assets to about 25 billion over the past 10 plus years. So that's very important. And if you think about what is underlying those funds, it is folks like you and I who have pensions with local managers. For some people, it could be their very first foray into the investment world, and it's important for them to understand where their money is going and what it's doing. And that creates a bigger story, a better story for the global private equity audience as well.
I think it's important to underscore the fact that investment is risky. So when anyone is taking an investment, it's on the understanding that they'll be able to get a return out of a particular investment, or there's a likelihood also that that return might not be there. But given the growth rate in Africa, what we have seen and experienced is that we don't want to end up with a large middle income economy who are basically consumers. We need to make investments because the need for these particular investments will be there given the growth rate of the African population. So in terms of return, it's something that you don't need to worry. I mean, Africa has had people coming in since 1890s, setting up. I mean, if we didn't have any resources to talk about investment in Africa, we should have stopped doing this 100 years ago. So we don't need to give an investor an assurance that, listen, this is good, you'll be able to get your money back. If people have been doing business in Africa for the last 100 years and they're still doing it now, it means that there is an opportunity for them to be able to get a return.
Basically what it does is that it's investors that come in and take ownership in businesses. And they provide skills and knowledge in addition to capital, in addition to investment or funds to help expand the business. And I'm going to talk more about the SMEs. Many of our SMEs stay small because they're driven by families, by entrepreneurs, and they may not have the ability to grow the business because they're focused very much on what the business does in terms of the operations, but they may not have the capacity to grow the business. And so we're missing out on an opportunity to do that. So your private investor will come in, take some ownership, and help them grow the business. And so I think it's a very important tool to build capacity of these SMEs, to create jobs, and to support economic growth on the continent. Is very welcome. I think that there are many aspects to innovative financing for growth on the continent, and private equity is one. Private equity will invest in businesses that exist. They're not going to create the businesses, they will invest in the businesses. But there are many other things that can happen. Banks need to be more innovative. We need to also look at how to expand financial access to people by providing them with bank accounts, but not only that, the ability to send money, the ability to save, as well as to borrow. And when I talk about people in Africa having a bank account, I'm talking about the bottom of the pyramid, because there is a lot of money that's circulating at the bottom of the pyramid that we're not capturing in the economy. And I think by building a more financially inclusive financial sector, we will capture those funds that can then be reinvested into the businesses. So private equity is a tool among others, and I think I'm very happy to see that this has come to the forefront of discussion at UNECA, that it has come to the forefront of discussion with the policymakers on what is private equity, how do we build this asset class, how do we regulate this asset class, how do we capture more domestic savings as a source of investment into this asset class.
The Africa Social Development Index is a tool that has been developed based on a request made by a conference of ministers for an African-specific indicator to measure exclusion on the continent. I think that when we talk about innovative financing or even investment, we talk a lot about investments in industry and infrastructure without thinking about investments in human beings, investments in health, investments in education, even in employment generating growth. I've just come out of a session on pension funds, tapping Africa's unused wealth. And it was all about private equity. So the question I was asking in that session was that yesterday we presented the African Social Development Index. How do pension funds go to invest in some of these areas, so that people have better lives? Housing, health, education, etc. These are legitimate areas for investment, and they have a direct impact on people's well-being and livelihood.
Well,
There are many, depending on which dimension you want to look at. The challenges around taxation, tax administration is very weak in Africa, but also they have to deal with extremely well-resourced multinational corporations, which have departments that specialize in tax evasion, in tax avoidance, and more recently you see also a tendency to move profits around and assign them to subsidiaries where the tax regimes are very low. Now, that's not a problem of Africa alone. It's a problem that even the advanced nations face. And then there are challenges around illicit, leakages, transfer pricing, over-invoicing and under-invoicing. And then we also have the historical problem of capital flight because of perceptions of risk, perceptions of political instability, and just not enough institutions that can regulate all these things. So all these challenges are there. I'm not saying that it's all gloom. Okay, I think there has been considerable progress. There's been investments by institutions such as the African Development Bank to build, tax administration institutions, and the financial services industry in Africa continue to improve, continue to provide products and services that are responsive to the small and medium enterprises, the informal sector. I think Equity Bank in Kenya is a typical example of the new energy and the momentum around financial intermediation and financial products and services and going forward. So yes, there are challenges, but I think progress has been made and there remain tremendous opportunities for domestic resource mobilization.
Specifically speaking for Transparency International, one of the tools that we have from the business sector side is dedicated to companies. So for a few years we've been looking at over 105 of the biggest multinational companies, and we're looking at their reporting practices. So we see from the publicly available information of these companies what they are doing and what they are reporting on anti-corruption, what they're doing and what they are reporting on a country-by-country basis. So it's not just their corporate reporting as a group of companies, but also on a country-by-country basis. And through that, we can also then make recommendations and see what touches most on the anti-corruption agenda, the illicit financial flows is, are they reporting profits where they make them? And that question is important because in terms of illicit financial flows, one of the practices is to report, to inverse the reporting. Some companies do report their profits where they feel they need to report them, where they feel they want to report them, and not necessarily where they make the profit. And that robs that country of its profits, that in terms of taxes, in terms of tax revenue. I think, as discussed, I think that point was touched upon by some of my colleagues on the panel. A lot of what is called illicit financial flows, as the chair put it, belongs to about 60% of it belongs to commerce, regular commerce, that is not illegal, that is not, it's not criminal. The criminal transactions and trafficking, and it belongs to about 35%, and then the bribery to 5%. So these 60% is using loopholes, is using regular weaknesses in institutions, weaknesses in the tax regulation frameworks of the countries, weaknesses in the laws, weaknesses in their judiciary systems, and in ways that they are able to get sometimes, or to be very specific, holidays, tax holidays. I think we have found governments welcoming, in terms of welcoming civil society organizations to work with them for the most part. And that is encouraged. That is extremely useful. Governments and states do not always have all the relevant capacities. Civil society organizations can come on board with research capacities, advocacy capacities, and that can help with supporting and complementing the agenda, even as developed by the governments. Sometimes this has not been the case. Sometimes there's been a bit of reluctance, and that needs to be clarified, because the truth is this issue is so complex that we'll need all the actors on board to be able to make anything out of it.
I think you're right, and this is not only something peculiar to the African legal structures. This also happens in the developed world, in the United States, in Europe. I think the most important is always to be quite conversant with not only the bold letters of your legal system, but also with the fine letters. There's so many ambivalence to the definition of a legal code. There's so many interpretations that could be given at the national and the international level. The most important thing is to harmonize, these legal writings thoroughly. The judiciary, the legislative, everybody should be very much aware of it. And sometimes you would find legal procedures that are written by companies, and invariably most countries simply ingest it because it came from some legal expertise. I think the solution to it is to read it very carefully, to see if it fits the context of your country, the concerns of your people. Certain legal procedures are quite wide in their coverings. What we have to do is to see if it's tailored to the particularities of your country, and also that rhymes with the international legal systems.
Yeah, the discussions we had in climate finance is basically that we need to mop up funds to solve climate issues. And Africa has, since the discussion on climate change became very topical, Africa has always had this attitude towards climate financing as passive victims of the issue, and always waiting for the international community to compensate for the historical emissions which they had. But in that session, what we have done is to move away from that pathway into a pathway that we can, as Africans, not just see ourselves as passive victims of climate impact, but as also people who could spring out opportunities out of these challenges. So the session talked about looking at low technologies, as creating business models out of low carbon technologies. The session looked at changing behaviors. The session looked at the policymakers playing very critical and central roles in intervening by designing new programs and projects that has business appeals, that has market appeal. So we want the market to reward sustainability. We want the market to reward low carbon technologies.
I think, first of all, when you look at Africa and the potential we have in the huge number of young people, the demographics already in themselves are a huge justification. If we can leverage the huge productive age cohort that is literally the numbers that we need, first of all, to influence climate change, but not just at an advocacy level, which is where many young people have been involved, but more so across the value chain of climate change, and getting into issues like agribusiness, which brings into consideration issues like product development, market participation, innovation, ICT, mobile applications. All these are ingenuity of young people that can be leveraged to make agriculture much more productive, especially in this 21st century.
I think you're right. It's a really broad topic, and I feel that some of it has been mentioned in the sense that we were talking about this difference between overseas development assistance and what we're calling new and additional funds. So there's been a lack of transparency in terms of, when a country A from a developed country says we're going to spend 40 billion on climate finance, it's not certain whether that 40 billion is new money or old money, if I can put it that way. So we need to have some kind of common tabular ways of reporting so that we can understand where are these monies coming from. Are they monies that are already being earmarked as overseas development assistance, or are they new and additional funding? So I think that is where the transparency issue lies. We haven't had a clear perspective in terms of how do you kind of demarcate the borderline between ODA and new and additional funding, especially with regard to adaptation projects, because many adaptation projects are considered in many ways as development projects. So that's where the issue of transparency comes from. Developed countries have not been able to show with sufficient evidence whether the monies they're putting into adaptations are monies that can be considered as new. There's a lot of adaptation projects that have been done with a number of development agencies. My sense is that what we need to do is to see how we ramp this up, how we scale it up, how we make it more impactful. There are projects that have been done to help farmers basically in terms of seasonal forecasting so that they can have the information available on time and be able to say, okay, this is what we're going to expect from this year in terms of rains or no rains. And on the basis of that information, decide the kind of cultivars that they would want to produce or plant so that at least they can prepare themselves better. So I think projects are there. You know, there are ideas in terms of how farmers can be less vulnerable, how they can use drought-resistant crops as well, how they can take advantage of waters that may not be available all throughout the year, etc., etc. A lot of projects on the ground are happening by many development agencies. But for me, the issue is not so much about what is happening at the micro level, it's how we scale this up to an extent that many other countries, many other vulnerable groups, you know, are able to take advantage of these projects and graduate from the smallness of these projects to something big.
Notre action, notre activité, on est une alliance internationale d'autorités locales, donc à la fois des villes, à la fois des régions, des provinces, etc. Notre focus, en fait, c'est de pousser au dialogue les autorités locales avec les autres acteurs de la société. Donc le secteur privé, les gouvernements au niveau central, quand il s'agit d'entités régionales, donc d'accords économiques comme avec l'UEMOA, etc. Donc d'avoir des vraies instances de dialogue, de créer des canaux qui permettent de défendre la vision des autorités locales sur le développement. Et notamment, pour ce qui est du FMDV, de travailler sur deux axes fondamentaux qui sont structurants des débats, qui sont le développement économique local et l'ingénierie financière. C'est-à-dire que dès l'instant où on parle de développement, de partenariat, il faut que cette discussion s'arme autour de mécanismes, de méthodologies de travail en conjoint. Et en général, la question qui fâche, c'est la question des finances, c'est la question de l'économie. Donc quel est le format de cette économie que doivent adopter les autorités locales, que doivent adopter les gouvernements centraux, que doivent adopter le secteur privé, que doivent adopter la société civile pour aller de l'avant. Comment est-ce qu'on configure ces outils? Quel type de banque? Est-ce que c'est une banque traditionnelle sur laquelle on n'a pas de contrôle, qui investit sur les marchés financiers, dans la spéculation? Ou est-ce que c'est une banque coopérative, une banque qui est basée, qui prend l'épargne locale pour la réinvestir localement et qui n'est pas là pour la pomper, pour aller l'investir sur des territoires qui sont déjà riches, qui n'ont pas besoin de ces investissements? Donc ça, c'est un exemple typique. Et donc le Fonds mondial dessine des ingénieries qui permettent de faire le pont entre ces différents acteurs et d'ancrer les richesses locales au niveau local, de faire en sorte que l'économie locale développe, finance le développement local.
What I'm getting at is we as a continent, if you go back in history, we fought for liberation from the top to the bottom, right across the continent. And we were incredibly united. And that's why we got the result that we got. In other words, we got Africa to be free right up to 94 with South Africa. But now, each one of us is looking to create partnerships with the outside world before we are joined up as Africa together. It can never work. That's why we are so divided, because we are not taking advantage of the market next door. If you don't take advantage of the market next door, you're not going to be strong enough to partner with people further afield.
The new partnerships can benefit Africa if Africa can be able to know what their interests are and be able to defend them. And this is one of the mistakes which Africa has made, going into partnerships without knowing exactly what Africa wants out of the partnership, and also putting resources to enhance those partnerships. So what came out here was that Africa, one, should be able to define and articulate its interests, negotiate those interests, but also put resources to be able to achieve what they set out to do.
I think here what I was really referring to, and I am quite passionate about this, is the instinct today to think that anything that can be done on this continent which is worth doing must have some foreign partner. And I have a complete disagreement with that. To the point where I say that if we were to fight for independence all over again today, too many of our leaders will probably have instinctively to ask the question, who are the donors who will accompany us? That spirit of self-reliance that we once had. So we come up with very good schemes. We come up with very good ideas. We come up with very good projects for the continent. And then we crumble when it comes to putting our money where our mouth is and begin to seek for other people to help us to realize our own ambitions. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. A very smart leadership will know how to leverage what kind of international assistance for what kind of domestic or regional goals, but not on the basis of planning your future on the assumption that other people will pay the bills. The world doesn't owe Africa a living, I'm sorry. And the world is also not very kind to people who do not get their act together.
Well, you know, it's tragic that because of Ebola, we kind of have a focus and an emphasis on the primary health care, which should have been a concern of ours for a long time. Sometimes we don't consider the global public goods responsibility on these issues, and that's why we have seen some of the institutions in charge of these issues internationally, such as WHO, having a dwindling contribution. Not long ago, about 2 years ago, they were actually reducing their budget for about a third. And we see the consequences is that we don't have a treatment of global public goods as we should. I think the investments in the health sector have actually gone up in Africa in general, but it's far from being what is needed or from covering what is needed. In Guinea, in the latest Mo Ibrahim index, Guinea actually goes up in terms of health systems, transformation, and some of the indicators are quite positive. But we must also say that when you have something like Ebola that is not known, it can create easily panic, hysteria, and also it can undermine the systems that you have if they are fragile. We are seeing that even in European countries, there is a bit of fragility because they don't know exactly this particular disease. So I hope that we are going to look into this area and this sector with a structural eye and not just when there is a panic and an emergency. Well, you see, agriculture is very important because the majority of our labor force is in agriculture, and we expect that their contribution to the economy, which is already quite small, about 6% of combined Africa GDP, if we continue with the same trends, will go to about 2% in 10 years or so. So that means more poverty because you basically have a situation where part of the rural population is moving into cities. And therefore, you may think that is positive, but they are moving into slums, and therefore, it doesn't change really their social condition. I think that is very problematic. But for those who stay, the recipe is rather simple. If we were to treat agriculture economically, normally we treat it as a social sector and we treat it as a poverty reduction program. If we were to treat it economically, it means that we need to increase agricultural productivity. There is no real example in the world where agricultural productivity has grown fast. There are examples of growing slowly, but growing fast is our concern because we have a lot of people on poverty without some incentive structure that is going to create, the mechanisms to propel this productivity. And the best examples we have are linked to industrialization. You industrialize a country and the agricultural productivity is pooled. And that is what we are trying to sell as an idea. And I think this fora had the opportunity of discussing innovative financing, but also the different mechanisms of policy that will create the right incentives. So agriculture is a very good example of that. Well, illicit financial flows, first we have to look into its complexity. There is a part that is outright criminal. So, people that are in drugs and arms trafficking and all kinds of traffics. So that's outright criminal. We need a very robust response. And obviously it has a lot of implications in terms of peace and security. Then you have another part that is not necessarily appearing as criminal, even illegal, but is hidden. We just don't know. For instance, taxation systems can allow multinational companies to have part of their activity in a specific country, let's say an African country, but actually never pay taxes because they will declare that most of the activity is somewhere else. If we don't have regulatory systems that are going to actually arrest this type of situation, you are going to have a lot of loss. And then, of course, you have also the entire discussion about trade mispricing, which is a big portion of illicit financial flows, which is paying less the value of the commodities we export. All of this combined, plus the fact that institutions are very weak and corruption is pervasive because institutions, when they are weak, they don't deal with corruption, and the lack of transparency from the origin countries of these companies. Like, for instance, the fact that we don't have transparency laws in Europe equivalent to what we have in the US with the Dodd-Frank legislation, create really a situation where the loss for Africa is quite huge. And at a micro level, you will see it from the extractive industries, for instance, that instead of, promoting small mining, there is a very important contribution of women miners in Southern Africa, but this is not given its due respect and opportunity because it's almost impossible to compete with those who are basically having their activity on the back of illicit flows. I think it's important for us to first say that the record is not very favorable to Africa in terms of various funds that have been created in the past. They had a target to support the most affected countries in need, and in reality that has not happened. The Global Environment Facility was created for that purpose, and eventually only 7% of its funds came to Africa. Now there is the Green Climate Fund, and there are other mechanisms that are being put in place. The RED is another one. All of those, Africa is not taking the full advantage of the opportunities that are announced. Not because Africa doesn't want, not because Africa is not prepared, but because the complexity that is associated with this type of funding makes it very difficult for a small entity or even a small country to be able to present meaningful bankable projects. So we have to change this. And that's why we are talking about climate financing as an innovative way of changing this picture, starting already with the creation of our own climate financing mechanism, which is part of a joint initiative by ECA, ourselves, African Development Bank and the African Union, which now has a fund based in the African Development Bank to deal with climate financing in Africa. It's a small amount, but that one at least we control, and we know it's a very good start for us to start changing the debate about how to handle this type of complexity.